Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 141 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin. That is Fia. Mike is off for tonight. We're recording on an unusual day, and Mike had some other stuff going on, so it was just the pair of us today.
Hello.
But if you remember from last episode what we're talking about parasitism. So it's a good thing we have Fia here because, spoilers, there's going to be a lot of invertebrate talk today.
They're the best parasites.
This episode made me itch and made my skin crawl so much in doing the notes for it. Just every time, and prepare for that as well, dear listeners. We're going to be talking about lice. We're going to be talking about ticks and fleas. Be ready. It's going to get a little gross. But yeah, so I'm excited.
Yeah.
It's the more you learn about parasitism, the cooler it gets and slightly more gross it gets, but We'll get there when we get there. First things first, Fia, would you like to do a little housekeeping?
Of course. So, as you all know, don't forget to rate the show on whatever platform you listen to us on, and to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube to give us feedback about the show and any future topics you would like to hear on the pod. And if you would like to be a guest on the show, be sure to fill out the guest form. And all that can be found in the show notes. And then, Gavin, what is next episode topic?
Next episode's also going to be a relatively Fia-heavy episode, because we're going to be talking all about bivalves.
Woohoo!
Bivalves are the group of mollusks that includes things like clams, oysters, scallops, things that live in the water that have two shells that fit together, more or less.
Yeah.
With a couple asterisks on that. There's another group that's very similar that is not here, that we've talked a ton on the show about before, called brachiopods, that are not these. But we'll learn all about them in 2 weeks' time.
Cool. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, and since our resident high school history teacher, Mike, isn't here to tell us a little bit of history, we're going right into Seagrass Corner to start us off. Sophia, teach us some marine ecology.
Yeah, so on Seagrass Corner today, we're going to go with charismatic megafauna, the manatee. Genus is Trichachus. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but they're aquatic, also called sea cows, I believe. And they're mostly herbivorous marine mammals. There are 3 species of Trichichidae. Basically, they look kind of like dolphins, but a lot chunkier. And if you haven't seen one, you should look one up because they're really cute.
Yes.
They are kind of named sea cows because they're herbivores and they just munch on the seagrass, which very fitting for Seagrass Corner. There's one species of seagrass called manatee grass, and they like to munch all on that. And as well as other seagrasses. They're not that picky, but that is one of their faves. And one cool thing about manatees is that they are marine mammals, but they need to drink fresh water. So oftentimes they will go up into rivers and streams, or they'll find freshwater pore systems in the limestone in the ocean and use that to drink their fresh water.
Manatees are some of my favorites. They're just so neat.
Mm-hmm.
They're just so cute and innocent looking. Sea cow is a very like apt name for them because they're just kind of like the whole vibe of a cow, but in the water.
Yeah.
And fun fact also, we also have a whole episode about them. Episode 56 was all about manatees and their cousins, the dugong. A cool, just general group of animals. I think there's 4 or 5 species total.
Yeah.
But yeah, they're best known from down in your neck of the swamp down in the southern United States and all around the Gulf.
Yes.
So thanks for that, Fia. And let's get into our main kind of gross topic today. Parasites.
I actually really love parasitism.
It's so interesting. once you get past the kind of ick factor,
Right.
parasites are super cool. And so it is that time of year, at least here in the Northeast U.S., where parasites are always kind of front of mind, especially if you are a pet owner. Because it's this time of year where you find ticks and fleas and various flies that bite. All of those are under the very broad umbrella of parasites. So let's get into it. Let's talk about them. So, like I said earlier, slight content warning. There is going to be a little bit of like, just generally gross, like honestly, like vaguely body horror. If you're gonna itch during this episode, because we're gonna be talking about, like I said, fleas, ticks, lice, a lot for the next hour or so. So just kind of brace yourself for that. And Sophia, especially with some of these concept episodes, I always start off. What is a parasite?
Yeah. So a parasite is an organism that depends on another organism to survive, and at the same time they're also negatively impacting that organism.
Right. That's generally the gist. And so we'll get to the actual like full definition of a parasite in just a sec, but we need to get a couple other definitions going in there first.
Right.
So parasitism is one form of symbiosis. And when I say symbiosis, most people think that symbiosis or like symbiotic organisms only mean like a relationship where both are helped. People confuse that with one of the types of symbiosis, which is called mutualism. A symbiotic relationship is just any persistent, close relationship between two organisms. Could be good, could be bad, could be neither, could be, neutral.
Mm-hmm.
But any like persistent relationship between two, not of the same species typically, relationship is symbiosis. And so the first type is, like I said, the one that often gets sort of synonymized with it, called mutualism, where both partners in the relationship benefit. For example, you and your dog. Both of you get good stuff out of your relationship. You get companionship, and then depending on, your dog, a guard dog to guard your stuff. And your dog gets a house, food, and its general needs taken care of by you. So both partners in this relationship benefit. The next is commensalism. This is where one gets a benefit and the other is neutral. It doesn't really benefit, but isn't harmed either.
Yeah.
The first kind of ick factor here, this is your relationship with the tiny mites that live in your eyelashes.
What?
There's a species, there's two species actually, of mites. So small arachnids that live in your eyelash follicles. You don't even know you're there, or that they are there. They don't harm you in any way. They eat some of your dead skin cells and some of the oil that is produced by the follicles. So they get a benefit, and you don't even know they're there.
I do.
That is a very good definition of commensalism. You get nothing, but the other one benefits. Parasitism is where one of the partners gets a benefit, and the other one is harmed. This is a tick, and if you go out for a hike, a tick that finds you and bites you and takes some of your blood, that because you are harmed because you are losing blood that your body is going to have to spend energy to replace, and the tick gets a benefit because it gets to take the nutrients.
Do you think is like a mosquito considered a parasite?
Yep, sure is. Although we will talk about that a little bit.
Cool.
We'll talk about mosquitoes specifically because they have a lot of interesting things going on.
Cool.
And so combining the subsection of parasitism with the overall definition of symbiosis, parasitism is a persistent, close relationship between two organisms where one gains a benefit, which we call the parasite, and the other is harmed, which we call the host. This does not, very notably, include predation. So basically, for the most part, the host has to live. So this isn't a lion hunting a zebra. That is not parasitism.
Right.
And it's there's been several, rounds of philosophical arguments about whether it does sort of count, but generally speaking, most people don't consider hunting parasitism. At least not if the animal is killed in the immediate result of the hunting.
Yeah.
There are some cases where parasites do kill their hosts, but it's typically not immediate like it is with hunting. And so with parasitism, there's generally, as with everything in biology and life sciences, there's lots of different ways to classify parasites and parasitism.
Mm-hmm.
So you can classify it based on where the parasite lives, whether it's on the outside, like a flea or tick. We call those ectoparasites when they're on the outside of the host. There's also things like tapeworms that are on the inside that are called endoparasites.
Nice.
There's also sort of mesoparasites that are kind of like in the skin fully, but not like fully inside the body. If that makes sense, this would be things like botfly larvae, stuff like that.
Before we go any further, can I share my favorite parasite?
Absolutely.
Okay, so there is an isopod in the ocean that gets in fishes' mouths and eats their tongue, I think. Somehow their tongue is gone. And then it becomes their tongue. And so when you look inside the fish's mouth, it's just like an isopod for a tongue. And it looks really fun.
Right, and so isopods, listeners, are roly-poly bugs or pill bugs, whatever you call them.
Yeah.
And so, and I was trying to find a good place to talk about them, this specific interaction, throughout the episode here. I didn't, manage to fit it in the notes, so I'm really glad you did bring it up, because that's just such a weird thing.
Love it. I've seen it in real life, and it's just so strange.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
They have like these little like hooks in the back of like their body that like they just like hang on.
Yeah, and fish tongues are kind of weird too. They're not like as fleshy as our tongues are.
Yeah.
It's more of just like a layer of like tongue cells that's kind of on a much harder like bony plate almost. And so at least as I understand it, the isopod eats away all of like the living cells and then just like anchors itself to the bony plate. And then I'm sure it eats some of like the food that the fish eats, but I think it also like directly like taps into the blood supply that should go to the tongue.
Yeah. Yeah.
Super cool, super weird. Everything in the ocean's weird. As per usual, most of the interactions that I'm going to be talking about through the rest of this episode are terrestrial. That's also where it's just the best studied, because we can control experiments of how these relationships work a little better. But however the weird interactions I'm going to say throughout this episode, I'm sure there are hundreds of thousands of weirder, grosser interactions out in the ocean.
Yeah, I believe it.
So we can classify the parasites based on whether they're inside or outside of the host. We can also classify them based on sort of how they get to the host. There's direct transmission, which is kind of the one that you are thinking of. A tick sits on a piece of grass and waits until a hiker or a deer walks by, and it just sort of grabs onto it. That is just the parasite just walks up to the host, more or less. There's trophic transmission, which is eating food that has parasites in it. This would be how most, like, if a human were to get a tapeworm, that would be how it happens. There's lots of different parasites. Like, if you ever hear about, like, romaine lettuce getting recalled or something, it's typically because of some kind of parasite contamination. This is how most endoparasites get inside their host, is just by eating them, because that's just the simplest way to get there. There's vector transmission, which is kind of like a third party. So this would be with mosquitoes, with malaria. Malaria is a protist, so a single-celled, it's not a bacteria, but it's a single-celled organism that sort of hitches a ride in mosquitoes. To my knowledge, it doesn't negatively impact the mosquitoes. The mosquitoes are just sort of how it gets around. And so the mosquito is the vector that it's basically Uber for malaria. So that's vector transmission. There's micropredation, which is taking chunks out of the host, like horseflies, or like cookie cutter sharks are another really interesting example. If you've never seen one, those are neat. Look it up. It's basically just a whole shark, and they're not small either. Where their whole mouth is set up to just like go up to a big fish, take a perfectly circular chunk out of it, and swim away. So it doesn't kill the thing. It just takes a chunk and runs away. And this is also, this micropredation also includes things like ticks and mosquitoes that take your blood. Technically, this would also include things like vampire bats as well. A weird one, and this is a weird ocean-specific one, that only a couple of different species do, but it's called parasitic castration.
What?
Yeah. So, basically, it is, there's some marine invertebrates who have, like, their gonads...
Oh my gosh, yes, I've heard of this.
...are on the outside of their body. Mostly things like crabs.
Yes.
And there are species of barnacle that get into the genitals of these crabs and basically cut off the blood supply to the gonads and basically become the gonads and take all of the nutrients that this crab would be putting into reproduction, which is a lot, and it takes those and uses them for itself.
I totally remember this in my master's work because, like, I was studying the oyster reef community and there were a bunch of mud crabs, and yeah, if they had, when I was like separate, like identifying them and whatnot, I would take out their eggs if they had them, or if in that case they had the parasite, I would take those out as well. Such strange thing.
I think even if you remove the parasite, I don't think there's any coming back. I think it fully, like, just basically destroys the reproductive capacity of it. And I think for the most case, it also, like, gets rid of the behavior of reproducing.
Wow.
So basically, it, all of the energy that would go to reproduction, and like time that the crab would put into reproduction, then is spent on gathering food, which at the end of the day means more food for the parasite.
That's weird. Wild.
This is exclusively an invertebrate on invertebrate thing. And the last one, which is also weird, is called parasitoidism. This is also pretty much exclusively an invertebrate on invertebrate thing, where it's you lay eggs in the host that when they hatch, they feed on the host, typically killing it. This is close to predation, but the adult isn't the one that kills it and eats it. So wasps are very famous for this. There's hundreds of thousands, if not close to 1 million species of parasitoid wasps alone. Where they will find like a caterpillar or like a cockroach, and they will lay one single egg in it and paralyze it, and then the egg will hatch and eat its way through the host, which dies sometime later.
This is where I'm starting to feel gross.
Yeah. Again, very, very common. There are literally tens to hundreds of thousands of species that do this. And so those are sort of the main different distinctions of parasites that you'll see, other than just, this one is an insect, this one's an arachnid. So other than phylogenetic, what group of animals or viruses or whatever they belong to, this is sort of how you see them classified as what kind of parasite they are. And typically, when you're thinking of parasites like this, and I think everything that I've mentioned so far makes parasitism its entire lifestyle. However, there are other things that technically sort of count as parasites, although they're not typically thought of as parasites, if that makes sense. There's something called social parasitism, which is only a thing in social insects, so things like ants, bees, termites, stuff like that, where the parasite is typically another of that same sort of group. So a one species of bee parasitizes another species of bee. But the host sort of invades a nest, lays its eggs that then get taken care of by the host. So not like taking blood or chunks or anything like that from the host, but mostly taking resources that would be going to it, that hive, the host hive. So taking resources instead of, like actively direct harm.
Yeah.
There's famously brood parasitism, which cuckoo birds are most famous for, but there are lots of birds that do this. Very similar to what I was saying with social parasitism, but there's some quirks with the social insects that make it sort of different. But cuckoo birds, instead of building a nest for themselves, the female will basically mimic a hawk or something and chase off the parents of some smaller species of bird from their nest, just so the parents go away from the nest. Then they will swoop in, lay one of their eggs, and leave. And when that egg hatches, the parents of the host nest will raise it like it's one of their own. And cuckoo birds, their chicks, grow extremely quickly. And for whatever reason, just the maternal or parental instincts of the host birds don't seem to notice that. So you'll see the cuckoo chick being 3 or 4 times the size of the host chicks, to the point where it muscles them out of the way when it's feeding time. And often we'll just push them completely out of the nest so it's the only one there. And it'll get to the point where the cuckoo bird chick is like the size of the parents or bigger. The host parents.
Wow.
And they'll still keep feeding it.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And then by far the most like common for non-parasites to do is called kleptoparasitism, which is just stealing stuff from others. This could be things like hyenas stealing a kill from lions out on the African savanna. That is technically parasitism.
Mm-hmm.
It's a relationship where the hyena gets the benefit because they're stealing food and the lions are harmed because they don't get that food. There's been lots of examples of different troops of monkeys in, like Southeast Asia or some places in South America, stealing things from humans in order to get them to trade stuff back, specifically cell phones. If you ever take a vacation to Southeast Asia and you see a monkey around anywhere, keep your cell phone in your pocket. They will steal it in order for you to give them food to get it back.
Smart.
Yeah. But that is parasitism. They are taking food from you. And so that is, you don't think of hyenas or those monkeys as parasites, but they do sometimes act in relationships that can be considered parasitism. Generally, for the rest of this podcast, we're going to be talking about, things that make it their entire lifestyle to be parasites. And also, for the rest of this podcast, we're going to be talking very animal-centric, but plants can also be very parasitic as well. There are some plants that are purely parasitic to the point where they don't even have any chlorophyll. They cannot do photosynthesis for themselves, so they only get their nutrients from the host plant. Also, I did just a quick, look through of some stuff for parasitic plants, and one that didn't come up that I thought would was called a strangler fig. It's a very, common, like, dense forest plant of Central America. We saw some when I was in Belize, when I was in college. But it's a plant that sort of grows up the sides of other trees. So if you've ever seen, some cartoon or something set in a jungle where there's like a hollowed out tree made of vines where the middle is hollow, but the outside looks like a tree, but it's like made of like vines or something, that is a strangler fig. And they basically use the inside tree as support, which doesn't always, but can kill that tree. It can just like get shaded out by the fig, and then die, which is why it ends up being hollow. I never saw that come up referencing parasitism, but it kind of seems like it to me. I'm not a plant person. I don't know.
I don't know.
But, so in general, lots of parasitic relationships with plants. We're not going to get into it because there's a lot of things that I don't understand about plants to begin with. Moving on to just some general features of parasites, regardless of if they're, internal or external parasites, how they get to their host, regardless. Some just general features. Firstly, in general, parasitism, like I mentioned, refers to the animal's whole lifestyle. There are some animals that do parasitism every now and then, like those hyenas, like those monkeys, but aren't true parasites. There are some that do it only for part of their lifestyle. For example, mosquitoes. If you know much about mosquitoes, if you've looked into them much, you'll know it's only the females that are parasitic. Male mosquitoes do not suck blood. They eat nectar from flowers, I'm pretty sure. And also, they only do that when they're getting ready to breed. I'm pretty sure the females also eat plant nectar until they are ready to lay eggs. Then they go find some blood.
Wow.
And so we think of mosquitoes as like one of like the archetypical characteristic parasites, but there's a little more to it with mosquitoes specifically. Another thing about parasites is that most of them will die, or at the very least not be able to reproduce successfully without a host. And that is kind of along the lines of mosquitoes, where it's like they need to take blood from something in order to produce their eggs effectively. They cannot do it without the host. And because of this, a lot of parasites generally share some features in common, such as being very small relative to the host. Think about one of the most common parasites that, humans have experienced in their lives, head lice. I'm very lucky that I never got head lice as a kid. But if you think about it, think about how small one louse is compared to a human. Like millions and millions of times larger than a louse.
Wait, I'm sorry. Did you just say a louse?
Yes, that is the singular of lice.
I did not know that. I feel like I should have known this.
Yeah, it's like, mice and mouse. Lice and
mouse.
Oh,
wow. Okay, the more you know.
Yeah. But yeah, so like I said, it is generally to the parasite's benefit to be very small. For a number of reasons. Number one, you don't want to be super easily detectable. If you can get what you need from your host without them ever knowing, that is very much to your benefit. And also, you typically don't want to kill your host. If you're taking enough of their resources to kill them, then you have nowhere else to get more resources from. We'll talk more about that later, though. A lot of parasites generally lose the ability to perform bodily functions that would be important for other organisms. For example, that plant that doesn't have chlorophyll anymore, producing chlorophyll and doing photosynthesis is like trait number one of being a plant.
Yeah.
There's also a type of parasitic jellyfish that doesn't even have mitochondria in their cells anymore.
What?
They cannot produce energy themselves at all. They must get it from their host.
Wow.
So what everyone remembers from like 9th grade biology, or maybe even like 6th grade biology, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and these guys don't even have that. That's how parasitic they have become.
Interesting.
And this is, this is the case in a lot of other things too. Like you think of one of the main characteristics of insects is that they can fly. They have wings. But pretty much all parasitic insects, things like lice, fleas, bed bugs, they've lost the ability to fly because they don't need it. If you can just stay on your host your entire life, that's terrific for you. That's not necessarily the case with some things like mosquitoes or horseflies, because like I said earlier, they don't do it for their entire life. So they have other things that they have to do for other parts of their life. But with fleas or bed bugs or lice, they live their entire life from being hatched to reproducing and dying on the same host most of the time. So why would they ever need to leave? Most of these that are sort of single host restricted also have generally poor vision, because what do you need to see for? You just need to tell which way is toward the body and which way is away from the body, because that's where your food is. And all that energy that would normally be spent maintaining and growing your wings and eyes and other body parts that you don't need can now be spent on reproduction, which basically makes parasites sort of like, to put it in sort of video game terms, parasites are like the absolute like min-maxed for pumping out as many babies as possible, as quickly as possible. So anything that they do that is not absolutely critical to their survival, they dump it in favor of pumping out more and more babies as quickly as possible. So those are just some general things that most parasites sort of have in common. So let's talk about some parasite life cycles, because some of them are relatively simple and then others are absolutely insane. This is where I started being like, wow, parasites are really, really cool. Like, there's a couple of these that I knew about, and then some of these others just kind of blew my mind.
Cool.
Many parasites, like a lot of the ones that you're thinking of, live their whole lives in one single host. From egg to adult to death on one single individual animal. This would be, for example, those mites that live in your eyelashes. You know, they hatch in your eyelashes and die in your eyelashes. Some, like I mentioned earlier, are only parasitic during certain parts of their lives, like those mosquitoes. Like the parasitoids, those wasps, they live like normal wasps for all of their lives until they're ready to reproduce. Then they go find their host, sting it to paralyze it, lay an egg in it, and then they go back to being a normal wasp. So that is generally, how some of them work. Then there are some that have very complex, multi-stage life cycles. Some just need two hosts. So there is the protist that causes Lyme disease. So it reproduces inside of deer ticks. That is the kind of tick that you don't want to get bitten by, especially here in the Northeast United States. They are everywhere. But they've been making their way west and south as well. But so this protist that causes Lyme disease reproduces sexually inside the deer ticks. But it sort of matures and gets ready to reproduce while inside the white-footed mouse, a species of mouse. Humans are actually a dead-end host for this parasite because it can't reproduce in us like it can. So our biology and internal body chemistry isn't what it's adapted for, like it is for the mouse. And so it actually does not want to be in us. That is a mistake. It doesn't like to be in us. But because this parasite lives inside another parasite, it ends up in humans sometimes by accident. But yeah, so the typical life cycle of this protist parasite is tick, mouse, and it has to go through both in order to sort of fully complete its life cycle. And those with multiple hosts sort of, they do this to sort of optimize their growth and reproduction. And this is further doing that min-maxing sort of thing. If they're able to grow really quickly inside one host, but this other host has different nutrients available that are better for, doing your reproduction, it'll grow in the place that's good for growing and reproduce in the place that's good for that. And an analogy that I sort of came up with for this is it's like living in a really dumpy apartment that's cheap while you're young and single, and then moving to a nicer part of town when you're ready to have kids. So you're doing what you need to that is best suited for what you need in the moment. That's sort of why they go through multiple hosts, because that was my first sort of question. Was like, well, things like tapeworms, I'm pretty sure that they can just live their whole life inside a single host. So why do these other ones need to go through all these different intricate steps? And that's really why. And so there's, like I said, there's the ones that are one host. There's these others, like that one with that protist that causes Lyme disease. That's 2 hosts. Mm-hmm. There are some with 3 or potentially more hosts. And so there's, in particularly flatworms, which are very well-known parasites for causing some pretty nasty diseases, and for having some of the most complex life cycles. So there's one species called the lancet liver fluke, which is Dicrocelium dendriticum, which has a 3-step life cycle that goes through ants, grazing mammals like sheep and cows and stuff, and snails. So this one parasite goes through 3 different phyla to complete its life cycle.
Interesting.
And so I'll explain what happens in each of these hosts in a little bit, because it helps explain our next topic, which is, in my opinion, the coolest and creepiest thing that parasites do, which is called host manipulation. So, in that liver fluke, the first host in the cycle are ants. They infect ants, and when an ant gets infected, it changes its behavior. At dawn and dusk, the fluke larva compels the ant to go to the top of blades of grass and use its jaws to clamp down really hard on the grass and just sit there. This makes it more likely to be eaten by grazers like deer and cows and horses and etc., which is the next host in the life cycle.
Right.
When it gets too hot or too cold, the parasite basically releases control of the ant, and the ant goes back to doing its normal life. But again, when dusk comes, the ant is compelled to climb once again to get ready to be eaten. Because that's typically when, especially deer, but a lot of grazing mammals will eat most heavily at those times of day. So it forces the ant to do these behaviors that it would not otherwise do, because it benefits it to get it into the next step of its life cycle.
This reminds me of marine parasite cycle that I've read about, where there's a snail that a parasite lays its eggs in, and then this killifish eats the snail, and it alters its brain behavior and like makes it like swim
Okay.
on the like top of the water, and then
Oh.
gets eaten by a bird, and then in the bird it um I guess maybe I don't know exactly where the cycle ends, but or like where it lays its eggs, but then it gets eaten by the bird, and the bird takes up the parasite, and then the bird poops, and then the snail
Right.
eats the poop. So it's like the only one that really changes the
Yeah.
behavior is in the fish, and it like basically makes it like, hey, like eat me,
Exactly.
which is so
Yeah, and
weird.
that's the case with a lot of these, where it'll only do the host manipulation on one of the hosts.
Mm-hmm.
So once, so what the this liver fluke does once it first gets in the ant is reproduce asexually. So it'll just make clones of itself. One of them will be the one that sort of fiddles with the ant's nervous system. The other ones will sort of turn themselves into like cysts inside the ant's abdomen, so
Mm.
that when they get eaten by the cow or the deer or whatever, the one that's inside the ant's nervous system, that one dies. So it does not get to reproduce or anything.
Yeah.
The other ones that are clones of itself are the ones that, because they turn themselves into cysts, they survive the cow's digestive tract and get into the intestines. From there, they make it into the cow's liver. They burrow themselves in there, and the liver has lots and lots of blood vessels and stuff that they, take nutrients from to get themselves all nice and grown. And then from there, they start producing eggs and reproduce sexually instead of asexually. The cows poop out all of the eggs, and you know who loves herbivore poop? Snails. Snails will eat the poop with the eggs in it,
Yeah.
hatch into larvae, which then again also continue to reproduce asexually, just making clones of themselves until there are thousands of them. And then at that point, they basically make the snail puke them up into this like ball of mucus that the snail just like pukes up. And ants apparently love snail mucus, so they
Yeah.
eat that and end up infected to start the process over again.
Wow.
Yeah. Another very famous example is a little more subtle of like sort of multi-host manipulation. It is a protist called Toxoplasma gondii that causes an illness called toxoplasmosis. It has two hosts, which are rodents and cats. When it is infecting a rodent, it changes the rodent's behavior, not quite like it does with the ant, where it like forces it to do something, but it basically changes their behavior to become more careless, shy away from predators less often, and generally reduce their anxiety, actually.
Hmm.
And in some cases, in some studies, it even seems like it makes them attracted to cat urine. All of these things make them more likely to get eaten by a cat. And then, they just end up in the cat. They don't, to my knowledge, particularly harm the cat all that much.
Yeah.
But they, get expelled in the cat's poop. That just sort of gets spread in the environment. Rodents are constantly eating everything. So it just ends up back in a rodent. And there's actually, I hesitate to actually say this, but if you research toxoplasmosis, it will probably come up. Is hypothesized that this is part of why people love cats so much.
Interesting.
Because people can get toxoplasmosis. If you've ever cleaned a litter box, you probably have been infected. And realistically probably still have the parasite in you to some degree. It doesn't, in some cases you can get like really, really sick from it, which is why they tell people who are pregnant that you probably shouldn't scoop litter boxes. But there's been some studies that suggest, that have since been kind of contradicted, but that this is potentially why people end up with like 1 million cats.
Ew.
I don't think that it really holds up, but it's, there have been studies done on toxoplasmosis changing human behavior as well. Yeah. There are some, moving on to more host manipulation, there are some viruses, because something we have not really talked about up to this point are viruses, which are universally parasites. If you consider viruses to be alive, they pretty much have to be parasites, no matter how you classify them. So viruses, there are some that infect caterpillars that make them permanently hungry, so they eat nonstop, which just provides more food for the virus to, take over cells and reproduce them and force them to, produce more virus.
Yeah.
And then it makes the caterpillar climb to a very high place. Then it makes the caterpillar's cells produce enzymes that dissolve the caterpillar into like a pile of goo that then all drips down from the high place, ideally onto other caterpillars for them to infect. Another very famous host manipulator, rabies. The rabies virus makes the host aggressive. It makes the host not drink water because it is transmitted through saliva. So if that's why, especially in like things like Old Yeller, the book that many people read when they're too young to read about a boy shooting his dog. Yeah, this is called hydrophobia. It's not actually called rabies. And the reason they don't drink water is that as host manipulation, the host does not want the water washing all of the saliva with the parasite in it down into the stomach because it can't survive in the stomach. And it wants all the saliva up in the mouth to be able to infect whatever this infected creature bites. There's I only have a couple more examples of these host manipulation, but like I said, this is one of the coolest, most interesting things that parasites do. There's a flatworm that infects snails, which are normally nocturnal, this species of snail, and it forces them to come out during the day. And when it does, this worm also moves up into the snail's eye stalks, where they pulse a bright green color to get the snail eaten by a bird, where the snail or the worms then reproduce. So they can't reproduce in the snail, but they can in the bird. So another, like you were saying with that marine one, changes the behavior to get eaten by a bird, where they then can reproduce.
Yep.
And then one of the most famous in sort of pop culture is the fungus Ophiocordyceps.
Please tell me more.
If you have watched or played the video game The Last of Us, this is that fungus.
I've never heard of that.
Very excellent show. If you have Max or HBO Max, whatever they call it now, 100% go watch it. It's 8 episodes of the best TV you'll ever watch.
Okay.
And the video game is also, I haven't played it, but from everything I've seen, it's phenomenal. But this fungus normally infects ants. It basically completely takes them over, to the point of like basically being inside, taking over as its nerves, basically. And it will basically, once it gets to a certain point in its life cycle, force the ant to climb, up above, to a high place where the ant will basically grip on with its mandibles and then die. And then the fruiting body, so the mushroom, will sprout from the head of the ant and rain spores down onto a nest, ideally, in the fungus's, life cycle. Ideally, it does it right over top of a nest. And so the whole concept of the video game and the show is that this somehow mutated and evolved to be able to do that in humans. And it's basically a zombie, world video game, but it's a fungus, not a virus. So yes, that is host manipulation. One of the most interesting things. And if you enjoy learning, you need to have a pretty solid base in bodily chemistry to understand how some of these things work. But if you want to learn some really, really interesting things about physiology, look up anything about host manipulation, just because all the different ways that they do this are kind of crazy. We're not going to go into it here because we're running a little long. So, with that, let's talk, but before we get into some fossils here, let's talk just about parasitism very broadly. And like, how common is parasitism in the animal kingdom? Just animals. So if you had to guess, hopefully you're not looking at the sheet right now, what % of all documented species are parasites? If you had to just throw out a guess.
I feel like maybe like 20%.
Okay. That's probably not far from what I would have said initially.
Yeah. Is it more?
But no, it is 40%.
Oh my gosh, that's almost half.
Almost half of all documented species are parasites.
Wow.
Not just ones that do dabble in parasitism like those hyenas or monkeys. Dedicated, obligate parasites. They have to do this as part of their life cycle.
I guess that makes sense because invertebrates are such a huge part of
that's a big part of it. Yeah. But also a big part of it is that parasites tend to be very host specific, especially the ones that can't move around a lot, like mosquitoes. And even then, mosquitoes, like the type of mosquito that carries malaria, it by far prefers humans over other mammals. It still can reproduce and take blood from other mammals, but it absolutely prefers human blood. But like I said, with those mites that live in your eyelashes,
mm-hmm.
They are human specific. They are not found in any other animal. Lice. Humans have 3 species of lice that are human specific. There's head lice, body lice, and then the STI, often called crabs. Those are a type of louse that is human specific. All 3 of those species are found on no other animal. And again, that's just lice, where there's just 3 that only do humans. Humans by themselves have hundreds of parasites that are specific only to us and cannot infect other species. And that's the case for basically everything. And so it makes sense for parasites to tend to be very specific in their host because it's easy for them to get evolutionarily isolated. You know, animals tend not to come in close contact with animals of other species if they can avoid it, which makes transmission harder. So it's easier for them to sort of become evolutionarily isolated from their close relatives. When's the last time you spent time in close physical proximity to a chimpanzee?
Not very often.
Which, as you would guess, the parasites that infect chimps tend to be fairly closely related to the parasites that infect humans. And so, basically, every time there's a split in the tree of life, there's a split in that same tree of life for the parasites as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it also makes sense that a lifestyle that has someone else doing all the hard work for you would be very advantageous if you can get away with it. So there's lots of different reasons for creatures to be parasitic. And it's also very hard to, once you go down that path, it's hard to, go back to being an upstanding, citizen, not parasitizing other things. It's very hard to do that because when you're an insect that's gotten rid of your wings, it makes it kind of hard to be an insect again, a normal insect.
Yeah.
So that's why almost half of all animals are parasites, because there's lots of reasons to do it, and then once your lineage goes down that path, it's very hard to not do that anymore.
Yeah.
And so with that, let's talk about some parasitism in the fossil record. As you can probably guess, being small, generally squishy, often single-celled. That's a big part that we haven't really talked about all that much, is that there are lots and lots of single-celled protists that are parasitic. Mm-hmm. Like I mentioned, Lyme disease, that's a single-celled protist. Malaria, that's a single-celled protist. That toxoplasmosis, single-celled protist, tons of them. Understandably, if you know anything about fossils, those don't tend to make very good fossils.
Yeah.
And so we don't have a lot of evidence for parasitism in the fossil record. We have some, but I'll get to those in a little bit. Instead, what I want to talk about first is how parasites drive evolution. Not just of themselves, but of their hosts. Because I read a couple of sources that say it's about 3/4 of all links in the food web in any given environment involves a parasite. 3/4 of all species-to-species interactions involve a parasite.
That's wild.
It's a lot. And if you understand anything about evolution, you can understand if something is taking up 3/4 of all of a species' interactions with its surrounding species, that's going to be a major factor in determining how that creature's evolution goes.
Right.
And so parasites, sort of by their nature, drive evolution of their host, because the hosts don't want them there, and those that can better resist their parasites will have better odds of reproducing. You know, how natural selection works. If your blood has like a slightly different chemical makeup than, you know, your cousins, that parasites like them better, and you can have 1% more kids than them, evolution will select for that. And then once that selection happens, parasites will have us either go extinct or adapt and, be selected to favor the thing that's becoming more common in the population. That's just how evolution works. And there's lots of other factors that are a little more like thinky, like philosophical, mm-hmm. than actually seen in practice, to my knowledge, when talking about parasites and evolution, because obviously it's very hard to watch evolution happen in real time. There are ways to do it, but it's very hard. And so just some general sort of how we understand, or how we think we understand parasitism and evolution. Parasites generally don't want their host to die. Right. We spend a lot of time thinking about parasites who go through multiple hosts in this episode. And in those cases, yeah, one usually dies. You know, if that snail gets eaten by a bird, yeah, the snail dies. But it's never the primary host, the one where the adults live and reproduce. It's always sort of the intermediary host. And in fact, the parasite need the host to survive in order for them to survive. So the parasite, while it is taking resources away, it is in the parasite's interest for the host to not be too badly injured. And as I kept reading about sort of these sort of hypotheses or things talking about parasites and evolution, I couldn't help but thinking back to the early days of 2020 and learning about COVID and learning about viruses as everybody became a virus expert on Twitter. And so viruses like SARS or Ebola kill their host too quickly for them to spread effectively on large scales. Then something like COVID-19 comes along, and while it's still deadly in a small amount of cases, you know, easily over 1 million people just in the United States have died because of COVID. But the fact that it's benign enough to spread without usually killing the host means that it's actually able to do its job, which is to spread from person to person, from the virus's point of view. And that's a similar case with parasites for the most part. And if you remember, a lot of people speculated that over time, COVID would become less illness-causing because the virus does not want to kill you.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're dead, you can't spread it anymore.
Right.
And so there's hypotheses that, in my opinion, have a mixed amount of support based on what I read. But if you look stuff up about this, you'll see it. So I think it's worth talking about. That suggests that many parasite-host relationships will transition into commensalistic or even mutualistic relationships given enough time.
Yeah.
And there's some evidence for how this could sort of happen. There's a few flatworm parasites that infect humans and some other mammals that do some interesting things that actually help reduce the effects of autoimmune diseases. So, like, in cases like that, there is at least the basis for how this could eventually become beneficial to be infected by this. Right. They still clearly do harm in taking the resources that they do, but the building blocks are there for how that could become a beneficial relationship eventually. Very similar to like all the bacteria and things that live in your gut.
True. Yeah.
We are running a little long here, but all of this to say, if you want to learn a lot about evolution and a lot of sort of philosophy about evolution, read up on parasite-host relationships because it is fascinating. And that is really only in the last, like, couple of decades where we've started to realize that when it comes to just, like, the sheer magnitude of how much parasite-host interactions drive evolution.
Yeah.
So yes, there's your homework from this episode. But on to the actual fossils here. The hardest thing about understanding parasitism in the fossil record is that even if you find two species together, you have no idea what the relationship between the two species was. They could have just been in the same environment. They might not have interacted at all, or they could have been, one could have been parasitizing the other. We just kind of don't know. With some, it is kind of clear. Mm-hmm. With ticks, all ticks are parasitic. So if you found a fossilized tick, sort of near the skeleton of like a snake or something, mm-hmm. yeah, it's pretty easy to say that this tick was probably parasitizing the snake or was at least present in the same environment, But there have been some examples of parasites caught like fully in the act, though.
Really?
Mostly with amber.
What is amber?
Amber is fossilized tree resin that sometimes has little critters inside.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so if you go to like a pine tree or something with like a machete and just sort of chop part of it, not cut it down, but just like cut through it, the resin that like the pine sap basically that comes out, that can harden if it's buried and preserve whatever's inside of it. Sometimes ants or various things will get stuck in it just because they happen to land on the wrong part of the tree.
Yeah.
And that will become fossils. Whole plot of Jurassic Park. And so in amber, the brief mention here, some sources of amber are better than others. Some sources of amber, like those found in Myanmar, are potentially mined with slave labor and traded unethically. That's always worth mentioning when talking about amber because a lot of this information we have comes from that. It's a whole thing in paleontology that people don't want to publish stuff from this amber, even though it is really, exceptional science. But always throw that out whenever we talk about amber. But anyway, there's been examples of amber with an insect caught in the amber with nematode parasites, so like little roundworms trying to escape from it as it was dying in the amber. So as the insect got caught, the parasites knew this and that the insect was dying, so they tried to jump ship and got caught anyway.
Cool.
We have amber fossils of spiders with mites on them. And like that's the level of detail that amber can give us, is that you can look closely enough to see a mite on a spider. Yeah, so that's the biggest thing. And even way back to the earliest amber we have, I think, is from like late Triassic, I think. So that would be somewhere in the ballpark of like 250, 260 million years ago or so.
Yeah.
And it seems like even back then, a lot of these different groups were around and doing their parasitic thing. Mm-hmm. So basically, as long, especially a lot of these invertebrate groups, like the flatworms, I'm sure the flatworms have been doing parasite things since the Cambrian. So, over 500 million years.
Right.
There's also been some evidence of parasite cysts found in coprolites, which are fossilized poop. From way also back in the Triassic period. So there are ways to find it, but how it sort of started is kind of a big question.
Yeah.
A question mostly in the sense that we don't have the evidence for it, not that we don't understand how it could happen, because there are single-celled organisms that parasitize other single-celled organisms. So it's clear that this is one of the world's oldest professions.
Yeah.
We also have fossils of sort of indirect evidence, which like galls on tree fossils. If you've ever seen a tree with like the big bulbous growth coming off the side of it, that's from a parasite. That's the tree like trying to defend itself from the parasite, basically.
Wow.
We also have marks on Tyrannosaurus rex bones from that match up to a genus of parasite that's still around today called, I think, Trichomonas. That if you get infected and don't treat it, it can like scar your bones. It's mostly like a flesh parasite, but if you get it on a place where there's bone relatively close to the surface of your skin, it can leave marks on your bone as well. And we found multiple Tyrannosaurus rex bones with these kinds of parasitic indicators on them, which is really cool. And yeah, that is parasitism. So it's been a weird, gross, itchy ride.
Yeah.
But I think if you are interested in evolution and you think you have a pretty solid base on how evolution works, and want to learn more, look up anything about parasitism. It is so cool.
Right.
And if you want to do any if you want to go into academia, I think there's a lot of really great research to be done if you've got the stomach for it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, do you have any last thoughts about parasitism and parasites?
Just that I will definitely be taking a shower after this because I feel icky.
Yeah.
But it was fun.
Those mites living in your eyelashes.
I'm going to scrub my eyelashes so hard.
Like I said, you don't even know they're there.
I know.
They're not even parasites because they don't hurt you in any way.
Yeah.
They are sort of related to the ones that cause mange in dogs and raccoons and stuff. So I will say that they can get a little out of control.
And on a happy note, Gavin.
On a happy note, this has been episode 141 of I Wish You Were Dead, a podcast about things that used to be alive. My name is Gavin. That has been Fia. Mike will be back with us in a couple of weeks when we're talking about bivalves. Very excited for that one. And until then, take care, everybody. This episode of I Wish You Were Dead was written by Gavin Davidson and hosted by Gavin Davidson, Mike Bryson, and Fenella Campanino. It was sound edited and edited for YouTube by Gavin Davidson. Special thanks to former guests of the pod and to listeners like you.